Lieutenant General Seizo Arisu spent the last 3 years of the war running Japanese Army intelligence. From August of 1942 until the surrender, his office, the 2nd Bureau of the Army General Staff, was responsible for breaking American military codes. After the war ended, in occupied Tokyo in the autumn of 1945, American debriefers from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey asked him what he had managed to read. He gave them an honest answer. The Army's codes? Yes. The Army Air Corps' codes? Yes. The Marine Corps' tactical traffic in the Pacific? No. They had never broken it. They had not, by the end, even been able to identify what language it was in. That admission is recorded today on the Naval History and Heritage Command's official fact sheet on the Code Talkers. And to understand the answer that Arisu could not give in 1945, you have to walk back 80 years before then, to a country of red rock canyons and high desert grass that the Navajo called Dineta, and watch what happened there in the autumn of 1863, when an American officer made a decision that would still be reverberating in a Marine radio shack on Iwo Jima 82 years later. The Empire of Japan in 1942 had one of the most accomplished military intelligence services on Earth. By every measure of cryptographic skill that the profession recognized in the middle of the 20th century, Imperial Japanese intelligence should have been able to break anything the United States Marine Corps put on the airwaves. They had been chewing through American Army field ciphers since before Pearl Harbor. They had pulled apart American merchant shipping codes well enough to reconstruct convoy schedules months in advance. In the late 1930s, they had even pieced together fragments of the State Department's diplomatic traffic. None of this prepared them for what was waiting on the Marine Command frequencies in the Pacific, because none of their methods could read it. In August of 1863, Brigadier General James Henry Carleton, commander of the Department of New Mexico, gave Colonel Christopher Carson, leading the 1st New Mexico Volunteer Cavalry, an order that Carson did not particularly want. Carson was to ride into the Navajo homelands and break the Navajo people. He was not to engage them in pitched battle. He was to destroy the things that kept them alive. Through the late summer and fall of 1863, and through the bitter winter that followed, Carson's troopers moved through the Dineta burning cornfields, slaughtering sheep, and cutting down the peach orchards in Canyon de Chelly that had been growing there for generations. By January of 1864, when his men closed on the canyon for the final operation, the Navajo were not defeated by gunfire. They were starved into surrender. What followed is remembered by the Navajo people as Hueldi, the place of suffering. The white historians call it the Long Walk. Beginning in the spring of 1864, more than 10,000 Navajo men, women, and children were forced to march on foot, sometimes as far as 450 miles, from their homelands to a 40-mile square reservation on a barren stretch of the Pecos River in eastern New Mexico called Bosque Redondo. Hundreds died on the trail. Pregnant women who could not keep up were shot. Stragglers were shot. Children were taken by slave traders. The Bosque had been chosen as a reservation site against the explicit objections of army officers who had ridden the country and knew the soil could not feed 1,000 people, much less 10,000. The crops failed every year. The water was bad. A smallpox-like illness moved through the cramped camps in the second winter. Roughly 1 in 3 of those interned at Hueldi would die there before the Treaty of Bosque Redondo released the survivors on June 1, 1868. Walking home, the survivors carried a language. The Treaty of Bosque Redondo had given them back a fraction of their original homeland and the right to live on it. But the country they returned to in the summer of 1868 was wrecked. The fields were ash. The orchards in Canyon de Chelly that Carson's men had cut down would take 3 generations to grow back. The Navajo rebuilt anyway. They received a small allotment of sheep from the federal government as part of the treaty terms, and they began the slow work of restoring the herds that had been the basis of their economy before the war. The grandparents and great-grandparents of the men who would, in 1942, sit in a locked room at Camp Elliott building a code in a language the federal government had tried to extinguish, were the same generation that walked out of Hueldi carrying that language home. The United States government, having concluded the military project, was already turning to a different one. Through the late 19th century and well into the 20th, the Bureau of Indian Affairs operated a network of boarding schools whose explicit policy was the removal of Navajo children from their families and the eradication of the Navajo tongue. Children were taken at 6 or 7, their hair was cut, their clothes were taken away. They were given new English names, often the names of dead American presidents, and warned in plain language not to use the language they had spoken at home. When they slipped, as small children do, they were beaten. Some had their mouths washed with lye soap. Some had their tongues struck with rulers. The architect whose model the Navajo schools were built on was Captain Richard Pratt, founder in 1879 of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Pennsylvania. Pratt's slogan, often shortened in retelling, was originally 8 words long: "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." The shortened version, "Kill the Indian, save the man," is what most readers know. Pratt's original sentence was the more revealing one. He believed there was something inside a Navajo or a Lakota or a Cherokee child that had to be cut away in order for what he called the man to remain. The language was first on his list. The Navajo language, the United States government had decided, would not survive the 20th century. It survived anyway. It survived because Navajo grandmothers spoke it to babies in cradle boards out of earshot of the schools. It survived in the whispered nightly prayers of children who had been beaten for it that morning. Most of all, it survived because Navajo families taught their children to live a kind of double life, an English life for the schools and the trading posts and the cavalry forts, and a Navajo life for the home, the sheep camp, the ceremonies, the prayers spoken at sunrise that white teachers were never meant to hear. A boy named Chester Nez, born in Chicxulub, New Mexico, in 1921, was sent to a Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding school at Tohatchi at the age of 8. He arrived speaking no English. The teachers did not care. He was given the name Chester after the late President Chester Arthur. He was warned not to speak Navajo. When he forgot the warning, he was punished. 7 decades later, in the memoir he wrote near the end of his life with the journalist Judith Sheese Avila, Nez would describe the boarding school years in a voice that was still careful with anger, even then. He described the system as a system designed to remove him from himself. By the time Imperial Japan struck Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, perhaps 30 non-Navajos in the entire world spoke the language with any fluency. The Navajo themselves numbered around 50,000. They were second-class citizens in the country whose fight they were about to volunteer to join. New Mexico would not let them vote. Neither would Arizona. Their grandparents had walked whaledy. Their mothers had been beaten in classrooms for speaking the tongue they spoke at home. And it was at this moment, with the Pacific Fleet half sunk in the harbor mud, that the question of military communication was about to become a matter of life and death for the United States Marine Corps. The Marine Corps in the early months of the Pacific War had a problem so embarrassing that few histories of the conflict spend much time on it. Everything the Marines said by radio, the Japanese were reading. American operational ciphers in 1941 and 1942 were a patchwork of older systems, hand-encrypted message books, and slow mechanical devices. A typical tactical message between a Marine battalion and its parent regiment had to be written out in English, fed through a coding machine word by word, transmitted, received, and then run back through a machine on the receiving end. The whole cycle could take half an hour. In a battle measured in minutes, half an hour was eternity. Mechanical ciphers had to be reset frequently, and even when reset they could not keep pace with the speed of an amphibious assault. Worse than the speed problem was the security problem. Japanese signals intelligence units, which had been quietly built up through the late 1930s into one of the most experienced cryptanalytic services in Asia, had been chewing through American ciphers since well before the war began. Low-level Marine field traffic was being read almost in real time. The reverse, ironically, was also true. American naval cryptanalysis was about to achieve one of the great cryptographic successes of the war. In the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration Building at Pearl Harbor, a unit known to the Navy as Station Hypo, working under Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort, had begun reading fragments of the Japanese Navy's main operational cipher, JN-25, in the early weeks of 1942. By spring, Rochefort and his cryptanalysts were producing enough recovered text to give Admiral Chester Nimitz a working picture of Japanese fleet movements. In May of 1942, they identified Midway as the next Japanese target, a recovery that made the American victory at Midway in June possible, and a year later they would help arrange the targeted shoot-down of Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's transport over Bougainville. Both sides, in the larger picture, were reading each other's mail. The trouble for the Marines was that the Navy's strategic codes were holding while their own tactical codes, in the foxholes and on the radios at battalion command posts, were not. When the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, the men in the foxholes around Henderson Field did not have a secure way to call for artillery, to coordinate movements between battalions, or to report what they were seeing. The Battle of Savo Island, fought offshore 2 nights after the landings, became the worst single defeat in the surface combat history of the United States Navy. 4 Allied heavy cruisers were sunk in roughly half an hour. The Marines on the beach watched the night sky flash and assumed they were next. They were short of ammunition, short of food, and short of medical supplies. The Japanese commanders pushing reinforcements down the slot from Rabaul were operating with a clearer picture of American intentions than the Americans themselves had, in part because they were reading American radio traffic. The official Imperial Army assessment of the Marines, recovered after the war, called them brave but predictable. Their codes, the assessment went on, were a curtain of paper. The man who would change that was not a soldier. He was a 49-year-old civil engineer for the Los Angeles Water Department named Philip Johnston, born in Topeka, Kansas in September of 1892, the son of a Protestant missionary who had brought his family to a mission station near Loop, Arizona, in 1896. Johnston had grown up speaking Navajo with the Navajo children he played with on the reservation. At 9, in 1901, he had served as the translator when his father took 2 Navajo leaders to Washington to ask President Theodore Roosevelt to expand the boundaries of the Navajo reservation. He had served in France in the First World War, and during that war he had heard about a small experiment the United States Army had run with Choctaw soldiers, 8 men deployed in late October of 1918 during the Meuse-Argonne offensive who had transmitted operational messages in their native language and baffled the Germans completely. Johnston had filed the memory away. Pearl Harbor brought it back. He had read in the newspaper that the Army was experimenting with Native American language transmission again, on a small scale, in field exercises in Louisiana. He sat down at his kitchen table and made the calculation that would shape the rest of the Pacific War. Johnston knew that Navajo, in the late winter of 1941 and the early weeks of 1942, was almost the only language on Earth that had everything the military needed and nothing the enemy could exploit. It had no written form. There was no published grammar. The tones could shift the meaning of a word entirely on a slight rise or fall in the speaker's voice, and the verb structure could pack an entire English sentence into a single conjugation. No German university and no Japanese institute had ever studied it. He went to the Marine Corps. In late February of 1942, with 4 Navajo friends he had recruited from the Los Angeles shipyards, he gave a demonstration at Camp Elliott, north of San Diego, in front of Major General Clayton Vogel, the commanding general of the Amphibious Corps, Pacific Fleet, with the Amphibious Force Communications Officer Major James E. Jones running the test. Vogel handed the Navajo speakers a typical 6-line English combat message. They translated it on the spot, transmitted it across the room in Navajo, received it on a second radio, and translated it back to English. Total elapsed time, about 20 seconds. The mechanical coding machines of the day required 30 minutes to do the same job. Vogel watched his stopwatch, looked at the translation, and recommended to the Commandant of the Marine Corps that the Marines recruit 200 Navajos at once. The recommendation was reduced to a 30-man pilot project. The Code Talker program was born in that room. The men who actually built the code, however, were not Johnston. They were 29 young Navajo Marines who had not yet finished boot camp. The recruiting drive that produced them ran on the Navajo Nation in April of 1942. Marine Corps recruiters set up at trading posts and high schools and at the Federal Public Health Service office at Fort Defiance, Arizona. They were not allowed to say what the assignment was. The order from headquarters had described it only as special duty. The Navajo who showed up to be examined were tested for English and Navajo fluency, given a basic physical, and asked questions designed to filter out anyone who could not handle the secrecy that was already being planned around the program. The men came forward for a mix of reasons. Some came for steady pay in a part of the country where the Great Depression had never really ended. Some came because the Navajo tradition held that defending one's land was a warrior's duty, and the Pacific War, even from Chilchilta and Tuba City, looked like a war over land. Some came because their grandparents had taught them the country between the four sacred mountains was not to be lost again. 250 Navajo men reported to Fort Defiance for examination. 29 were chosen for the pilot program. They came from Chinle and Crystal and Chilchilta and Tuba City and Fort Defiance, places that most Americans in 1942 could not have found on a map. Most of them had grown up herding sheep. Most of them had been sent through the same boarding schools that had punished them for speaking the language they were now being asked to weaponize. They were sworn into the Marine Corps at Fort Wingate, an old Army fort on the Navajo reservation that had been converted into a Bureau of Indian Affairs boarding school, on May 4, 1942. The irony of the location was not lost on them. They went through standard Marine boot camp at the recruit depot in San Diego as Platoon 382, the first all-Indian, all-Navajo platoon in Marine Corps history, and they graduated on June 27th. From there, they were sent to Camp Elliott. A Marine major they had never met before walked them into a locked room, told them they were going to develop a military code in their own language, walked back out, and locked the door behind him. What those 29 men did over the next 2 to 3 months has no real parallel in the history of practical cryptography. They did not have a single trained cryptographer among them. They had no academic training in linguistics. They had a lifetime of speaking a language that had survived a federal effort to extinguish it, and a clear understanding that the Marines on Guadalcanal were dying because their messages were being read. The code they built had 2 layers. The first was a phonetic alphabet, in which each letter of English was assigned not one but several Navajo words, so that the letter A could be the Navajo word for ant, or apple, or axe. That redundancy meant that even if a Japanese listener somehow figured out one substitution, the same letter would be encoded a different way the next time it appeared. The second layer was a vocabulary of military terms that did not exist in Navajo at all. Submarine became iron fish, a tank became a tortoise, a dive bomber became a chicken hawk, a battleship became a whale. The word for America, in their code, was the Navajo phrase that meant our mother. Each one of these substitutions had to be agreed on, debated, and memorized by all 29 men, because the code would never be written down by anyone who used it in combat. It existed only in the heads of the men trained to speak it. The decision-making that produced these substitutions was collective, pragmatic, and often funny. The men argued about which Navajo word fit, which English meaning. They picked words that were short, distinctive, and resistant to confusion over a noisy radio. They picked words that a native Navajo speaker who had not been trained in the code would still hear as ordinary nouns from daily life: sheep, water, eyes, deer, beaver, eagle, so that a transmission would not even sound like a transmission to someone who happened to know the language, and they picked associatively. A submarine moves underwater and looks like a fish, so it became iron fish. A tank moves slowly and is hard-shelled, so it became tortoise. A dive bomber stoops on its prey, so it became chicken hawk. The associative logic was not a security weakness, it was a security feature. There was no way for an outside cryptanalyst, working only from intercepted audio, to reverse engineer the leaps the men had made in that locked room. When the men were tested on the finished code, they could encrypt and transmit a 3-line battlefield message in roughly 20 seconds. The Marine Corps' evaluation went further than a stopwatch. The cryptography section sent in a team of trained American cryptographers, men who had spent the early years of the war breaking other people's ciphers, and asked them to break this one. They were given recordings of code talker transmissions in a closed room. They could not even transcribe the sounds of the words on paper, much less reduce them to a cipher key. One of them, in a written report, complained that the language sounded like nothing he had ever heard, and he had heard a lot. The Marine Corps approved the program for combat use. By the late summer of 1942, The first Navajo Code Talkers were aboard ships steaming for the South Pacific. The dictionary they had built started at 211 vocabulary terms and would expand to 411 by the end of the war. The codebook is now declassified. You can read the full version, revised in June of 1945 and released under Department of Defense Directive 5200.9 on the Naval History and Heritage Command website. Where there was no existing Navajo word for a piece of equipment, the men reached into the natural world they had grown up in. A minesweeper became a beaver. A transport ship became a man-carrier. A cruiser became a small whale. They built a system for the months of the year drawn from the agricultural calendar of the Navajo Nation. January was the month of the small eagle. November was the big wind. December was the crusted snow. They built code words for the names of countries. America was our mother. Britain was between waters. Germany was iron hat. Australia was rolled hat. As the war went on, an American cryptographer monitoring the Code Talkers' own transmissions warned that the original alphabet might be cracked through the simple weakness of repetition, since some letters appear far more often than others in English. The men adjusted. They added second and third Navajo words for the most common letters, and the alphabet eventually grew from 26 terms to 44. The whole system, when it was finished, ran to several hundred entries that would never appear on any piece of paper carried into combat. Who actually built it is worth pausing on. They were not officers. Most were teenagers or men in their early 20s. The youngest of the original 29, a man named William Dean Yazzie, was 15 or 16 when he enlisted, depending on which account you read, and he later said in an interview that he had moved his recruiting folder under a stack on the recruiter's desk so it would not be checked for a parental signature. The oldest, a painter and rancher named Carl Gorman, born in Chinle, Arizona in October of 1907, was 34 at enlistment. Gorman knew the Marines wanted men under 30 for the program. He told them he was 28. He spent the war as a code talker. He came home and became one of the most beloved Navajo artists of the 20th century. They were boys and men who had grown up in homes without electricity. Many of them had never seen the ocean before they were on a troop ship sailing across it. They were going to fight in a country whose language they did not speak, against an enemy who had never seen them, on behalf of a government that did not consider them full citizens. They went anyway. If you have a relative who served in the Pacific, in any branch, in any unit, leave their name in the comments. The names matter. Tell me where they fought. Tell me what they remembered. Now, back to the war. The first group of code talkers reached Guadalcanal on September 18, 1942, coming ashore at Lunga Point to join the 1st Marine Division, which had landed on August 7th and had been holding the perimeter for 6 brutal weeks. The second group, which included Chester Nez, the 21-year-old from Chichilta, who had been punished as a child at the boarding school in Fort Defiance for the language he was now broadcasting on an open radio frequency, joined the campaign in early November. Nez sent his first combat transmission on Guadalcanal a few days after his arrival. It was a request for an artillery strike on a Japanese machine gun nest. The artillery hit exactly where he had directed it. The gun went silent. Nez, in his memoir, would describe the feeling as exhilarating. The language his teachers had tried to beat out of him had just kept American Marines alive. By Tarawa, in November of 1943, code talkers were attached to every Marine division in the Pacific. By Saipan, in June of 1944, Marine commanders were so dependent on them that requests for code talker support arrived at division headquarters faster than the code talkers could be trained and deployed. The men worked in pairs. One operated the radio. The other relayed and received messages. They never wrote down the code. Every transmission they received, they decoded in their heads in real time and translated into English on the spot. A typical encoded message that crossed the airwaves might sound, to anyone unfamiliar with the system, like a string of unrelated Navajo words for animals, weather, household objects, parts of the body. To a trained code talker on the receiving end, those words assembled themselves instantly into something like, request artillery fire on coordinate 1, 2, 3. Company E move 50 yards to the left flank of Company D. Speed and security in the same package. speed the United States military had never had before, and security that no enemy in the Pacific could touch. The conditions under which they worked are difficult to describe to anyone who has not seen combat photography from the islands. A code talker on Tarawa carried a portable field radio that weighed roughly 40 pounds, strapped to his back across a beach where the 2nd Marine Division would lose nearly 1,000 killed in 76 hours of fighting. A code talker on Peleliu in September of 1944 worked in coral caves at temperatures above 110 degrees Fahrenheit, in air thick enough with limestone dust to coat the inside of a man's mouth in minutes. A code talker on Okinawa in the spring of 1945 operated through 82 days of rain, mud and artillery, sometimes calling naval gunfire onto Japanese positions within 50 yards of his own foxhole. The men did this without writing anything down. They did this in pairs, often on radios that had been damaged by salt water or shrapnel, sometimes after the senior of the pair had been wounded, sometimes after the junior of the pair had been killed, and the remaining man was now both transmitting and receiving alone. There was one particular danger that fell on them, and on no one else. The code talkers, in their olive-drab marine fatigues, with their black hair and darker complexions, were sometimes mistaken for Japanese soldiers by other American troops. Several were seized at gunpoint by Marines from other units who were certain they had captured an enemy infiltrator. Several came close to being shot. The Marine Corps responded by assigning each code talker a personal bodyguard, a fellow Marine whose explicit job was to keep the code talker alive and within friendly lines. Bill Toledo, who served as a code talker after the original 29 and gave an oral history about the program after declassification, later testified that the bodyguards had a second, unwritten order. If a code talker was about to be captured by the enemy, the bodyguard was to shoot him first, to keep the code from falling into Japanese hands. None of the bodyguards, in the entire course of the war, ever had to carry that order out. No code talker on combat duty was ever captured. The harder question is why none of this worked for the Japanese. The Imperial Japanese Army's Signals Intelligence Service was not stupid. It was not lazy. By 1943, it was one of the most experienced cryptanalytic services in the world, yet it could not break this code. Part of the answer is that Japanese intelligence had spent decades preparing to break written codes. Their training assumed that any enemy military communication, given enough time and enough intercepted material, could be reduced to a cipher key, a substitution chart, a pattern of letter frequencies. They had broken the State Department's Gray Code in the 1930s. They had broken low-level American Army ciphers throughout 1942. They had a method, and the method worked on every code they had ever met. The Navajo Code did not behave like a code in the way their method assumed. It had no predictable letter frequencies because it was not based on a written alphabet at all. It had no repeating cipher keys because there was no key. The substitutions, when they existed, were not mathematical. They were associative. They were the choices of men in a locked room at Camp Elliott, deciding that a tank should be a tortoise because both move slowly and have armor. There was no formula by which an outside cryptanalyst could derive that link. The Japanese tried a different approach. In late 1943, they sent linguists with portable recording equipment to forward listening posts on Bougainville and on the Marianas. The linguists transcribed code talker transmissions phonetically, sound by sound, hoping that with enough recordings they could begin to identify a vocabulary. They produced sheets of phonetic Navajo that they could not match to any known language. They consulted university linguistics departments in Tokyo. The university linguistics departments in Tokyo did not know what the language was. They suspected, by mid-1944, that it was a language spoken somewhere in the American Southwest. They could not narrow it further, and even if they had been able to identify it as Navajo, it would not have helped them. The code was not Navajo. The code was a layered system built on top of Navajo, designed by men who knew exactly what would and would not be guessable from the outside. A Navajo speaker who had not been trained in the code, hearing a transmission, would have understood individual words but not their meaning. He would have heard a string of words like sheep, eyes, nose, deer, that had no grammatical sense as Navajo speech and no surface meaning as a sentence. There is one moment in the entire war that should have given them a chance, and it is one of the most painful chapters in the story. In April of 1942, a Navajo soldier named Joe Kieyoomia had been captured by the Japanese during the fall of the Philippines. He was a sergeant in the 200th Coast Artillery from New Mexico, a National Guard unit drawn largely from the small towns of the southern part of that state. He was not a code talker. He had never been trained in the code, which had not yet existed at the time of his capture. He survived the Bataan Death March, the forced movement of more than 70,000 Filipino and American prisoners under conditions of starvation that has been recognized as one of the great war crimes of the Pacific. He survived the prison ships that the Japanese used to move prisoners to the home islands, the so-called hell ships, in which men were packed into unventilated holds and left for weeks. He ended the war as a prisoner in a labor camp near Nagasaki. Sometime in 1943 or 1944, his Japanese captors discovered that he was a native Navajo speaker. The intelligence service brought him recordings of intercepted code talker transmissions and ordered him to translate. Kieyoomia listened. He understood that the words were Navajo. He could pick out individual nouns: sheep, water, beaver, eagle. None of it meant anything as a message. He told them so. The Japanese did not believe him. He was punished for what they took as refusal. He was forced to stand naked in the snow until his feet froze to the parade ground. He was beaten so badly that he lost the use of one leg until well after the war. He told them again, repeatedly, that the words made no sense. The code was not in him to give. He survived all of it, including the atomic bomb that destroyed Nagasaki on August 9, 1945, sheltered, somehow, by the concrete walls of his cell. After the war, Kieyoomia returned home to the Navajo Nation. He lived to 1997. In an interview given near the end of his life, he said only one thing about the code talkers. He saluted them, and he said that even if he had known the code, he would never have given it up. The reason the Japanese could not break the code, in the end, was a reason that had nothing to do with cryptography. It had to do with culture. Imperial Japanese intelligence had been built on the assumption that any sufficiently determined power could break any code, given time and resources. The assumption was correct, as a general rule, for codes that existed on paper. It was not correct for a code that lived only in the heads of a few hundred men, all of whom had grown up in a culture that had spent 80 years learning to keep its language safe from outsiders. The boarding schools that had tried to erase Navajo had created, by accident, a generation of men who were native bilinguals. They could speak both English and Navajo with full fluency. They had also learned, as children, that their language was something private, something you did not say in front of teachers, something that belonged to your grandmother and your uncle and the fire pit and the cornfield. The code talkers did not need to be told that the code was a secret. The men using the most secure communication system the United States military would field in the Second World War had been trained in operational secrecy by their own grandmothers. By the time of Iwo Jima in February of 1945, the Navajo Code was operating at full capacity. The battle that began on the morning of February 19th was, by every measure the Marines used to grade an operation, a meat grinder. 20,000 Japanese defenders were dug into a network of caves and tunnels burrowed into volcanic rock. The American assault force, more than 70,000 Marines across the 3rd, 4th and 5th Divisions, would take 36 days to clear the 8 square miles of the island. Roughly 7,000 Marines would die there. 20,000 more would be wounded. The casualty rate was the worst the Marine Corps had taken in any battle in its history, before or since. Major Howard Connor, the 5th Marine Division signal officer, had 6 Navajo Code Talkers under his direct command for the assault on the island. They worked in 2-man teams, in 12-hour shifts, around the clock, for the first 48 hours of the battle. In that period, they transmitted and received more than 800 messages. Not one contained an error. Connor would later say, for the official record, that without the Navajos, the Marines would never have taken Iwo Jima. He meant it as a literal operational claim. The intelligence picture on Iwo, where the Marines were fighting an entrenched defender across volcanic ridges, depended on real-time coordination of artillery, naval gunfire, and small unit movement. The code was the spine of that coordination. Every artillery mission, every shift of a flank company, every supply request, Every situation report from a beachhead under direct fire moved through Navajo. The Code Talkers were never off the radio. When the famous photograph was taken on the 5th day of the battle, on February 23, 1945, by the Associated Press photojournalist Joe Rosenthal, of 6 Marines raising the American flag on Mount Suribachi, the message that announced it to the rest of the assault force went out in Navajo. The transmitting code talker spelled the place name out letter by letter using the official phonetic alphabet: sheep for S, uncle for U, ram for R, ice for I, bear for B, ant for A, cat for C, horse for H, itch for I, the 9 words spelling Suribachi. To the listening Japanese signals officers somewhere on the island, it was a few seconds of unintelligible noise. To Major Connor, it was the words American flag flying Mount Suribachi. We know what the Japanese Signals Service thought of the code because some of them survived the war and were asked. The most direct admission is the one that opened this video, made by Lieutenant General Seizo Arisue in the post-surrender debriefings, and recorded today on the Naval History and Heritage Command's official fact sheet on the Code Talkers. Arisu admitted that his service had broken the codes used by the United States Army and the United States Army Air Corps. He admitted that the code used by the United States Marine Corps had never been broken. The Tokyo evening newspaper Yukan Fuji, in a piece widely cited in American accounts of the program, observed that if Imperial Japanese intelligence had been able to decode the Navajo messages, the outcome of the battles on Saipan and Iwo Jima might have been different, and the history of the Pacific War might have turned out completely differently. It is not the kind of admission the press of a recently defeated empire usually puts into print. The question that hung over every Japanese listening post in the Pacific from 1942 to 1945 had an answer that nothing in their training had prepared them to hear. Who in the world had the Marines found to speak this thing? By the autumn of 1945, when Arisu gave the Americans his honest answer, the Marines had found around 400 Navajo men. Their grandfathers had walked Weldy. They had been raised in homes where the language was spoken in private and beaten out of them in public. The Japanese could not break the code because it was not, in the sense their training had prepared them for, a code at all. It was a culture, carried inside the heads of men whose government had spent the better part of a century teaching them, by accident, that the most important thing they owned was something to be kept out of strangers' reach. The program was classified at the highest level immediately after the war. The men were ordered not to speak about it, not to their wives, not to their parents, not to anyone. The order held until 1968, when the Department of Defense quietly declassified the program and the silence ended. By then, many of the men were dead. For the men who were still alive in 1968, the declassification was not a celebration. Most had been home for 23 years by then. They had worked as ranchers, as painters, as tradesmen, as government clerks on the Navajo Nation and off it. They had not told their wives what they had done in the war. They had not told their children. Some of them had been carrying nightmares about beaches and ridges they could not name out loud, and they had no framework for explaining what those nightmares were about. When the program was declassified, a handful of journalists came looking for them. Most of the men were uncomfortable with the attention. They did interviews reluctantly. Some refused to be photographed. Chester Nez later said that the secrecy had become a habit, and that habit was harder to break than the order had been. There is a part of the story that even the declassification did not bring fully into the light. Some of the original Code Talkers, including Chester Nez and William Dean Yazzie, served again in Korea, called up as Marine reservists in 1950. The program was still classified then, and the Department of Defense considered the possibility that the code might be used again in a future conflict. Whether the Navajo Code was actually deployed in Korea has never been confirmed in declassified records. The men who served there did not talk about it during the war and did not talk about it after. By the time the program was declassified in 1968, those who had carried it forward into a second war were carrying a second silence on top of the first one. Some of them took both silences to the grave. The recognition that came afterward came in pieces. President Reagan declared August 14th Navajo Code Talkers Day in 1982. President Clinton signed Public Law 106-554 on December 21, 2000, authorizing the Congressional Gold Medal for the original 29. 5 of the original 29 were still alive in July of 2001. 4 of them attended the ceremony in person at the Capitol Rotunda on July 26, where President Bush placed the medals around their necks. The 5th was too ill to travel. 24 medals were accepted by family members. Chester Nez, the last of the original 29, lived until June 4, 2014. He died at his home in Albuquerque, 93 years old. The Navajo Nation lowered its flags. If you found this useful, the like button helps the channel more than people think, especially after a strike. Subscribing keeps you notified when the next one goes up. There are a lot more of these stories left